So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back from lunch to our third session, Green Investment Certification and Compliance. And this session is going to look at compliance methods for promoting confidence and green investment and preventing greenwashing. So we're going to look to identify issues that would reveal a possible contribution by UNCITRAL to climate action by looking at those areas in which new international legal standards or guidance might be desirable, and by explaining how existing instruments can best be used to support private sector commitments. So we've left plenty of time for discussion, and we really would like to use it and hear just your responses, reactions, or the general mood in the room to the topic. So we're going to broaden out a little bit from the carbon markets and move more to carbon emissions reduction as well as removals once emitted. But we will also speak
Recording in progress.
We will also speak a little bit about the voluntary carbon markets as well. So we have four speakers. I'm not on my own. Tatiana and Chris are with me here, and Gabriella and Maurizio are both online, and I hope they'll pop up at least when they're speaking. So just to set the scene very, very quickly, what we have with the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement is the public international law net zero framework. And the Paris Agreement objectives mitigate the effect of climate change, that's reduce emissions, adapt to deal with the effects that can't be avoided, and align finance flows. And so Paris-aligned mitigation in particular, so Article 2.1a, that's implemented through commitments by states and their nationally determined contributions to reduce and remove greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that's not states alone. State parties' reduction removal commitments, as I said, in the nationally determined contributions, but non-party stakeholders are also an important part of this. So corporates' voluntary reduction and removal commitments are also very important and noted in Article 117 of the Paris Agreement cover decision, and also have led to the creation of the Race to Zero campaign within the UNFCCC. And then on top of that, there's mandatory national corporate laws, reduction and removal laws. So Article 6 is that governing supervisory body mechanism that sits within that public international law framework. But the key is, as the UNFCCC Secretariat says, the objective of achieving the objectives of the Convention requires collaborative action by parties to the Paris Agreement and by non-party stakeholders. So the corporates are going to play a key role in helping states meet their Paris Agreement greenhouse gas emission reduction commitments. And the needle has moved significantly as a result of corporate voluntary action towards that commitment. But there's no uniform and harmonised rules, and there's enormous scope for confusion by those making carbon mitigation claims, whether those claims relate to reduction of emissions or removals. And consumers of so-called net zero goods, services, or carbon offsets are often a little bit at sea. So the harmonisation is clearly desirable, but the risk of harmonisation in a top-down approach is that, in a way, it contradicts the architecture of the Paris Agreement, which is very much designed bottom-up, that states determine, each member state determines its own nationally determined contribution, and preserving differentiated responsibility and even the just transition of the workforce. So the starting point for our discussion today is going to be an examination of state party actions and how they're implementing their Paris Agreement and obligations through their national laws and through regulations in relation to how they govern carbon claims. So Gabriella is our first speaker. Gabriella Rodriguez-Martinez is the head of international climate policy and finance in the Mexico government in Mexico. She's beaming into us, I hope, imminently. And Gabriella is going to, so she's an expert in the design and implementation of climate policy and development of climate change projects. And she's going to introduce us to the very recent Mexican Sustainable Taxonomy its objectives, covered sectors, technical criteria, and safeguard. And we're going to move from that national legal framework, implementing those public international law commitments in relation to reduction of carbon. Then we're going to move towards some of the voluntary standards and what the industry bodies have done. So, Gabriella, I hope we have you with us.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm here, Wendy. Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
We can hear you well. We can't see... Oh, there we go. We can see your slides. So we can hear you well. And we can see your slides. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to switch to Spanish. So in case you want to change or to select your language. Bueno, en primer lugar, quiero...
First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers and the Commission for inviting Mexico to deliver this presentation on the progress that has been achieved from the Ministry of Public Finance and Public Credit of Mexico in order to promote green, sustainable investment. Equally, I'd like to send greetings on behalf of Under-Secretary General Gabriel Jordo, who is responsible for the agenda of promoting sustainable green investment in our country, who would have liked to have been here to share this information with you today in person, but I will be doing this in his stead and on behalf of the team. As Wendy said earlier, my name is Gabriela. I work in the Ministry of Finance and Public Credit of Mexico, along with my team, who work in the International Affairs Unit, and it's a real pleasure to be with you today, participating in this forum. And if you have any questions later, any comments to make, I hope that I'll be able to take them up at the end of the session. Next slide, please. Just to provide some context, it's important to note, as Wendy said, that this is really a pivotal historical moment where we are tackling climate changes, social changes throughout the world. And clearly these challenges require action from our governments in order to be able to implement policies and regulations that will lead to structural changes and development changes. These changes subsequently will make it possible to close social divides, for instance, poverty, inequalities, as well as environmental gaps that are significant too, and which we face, such as climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and also ecosystem services that are provided by nature. Meeting development goals, as set forth in the Paris Agreement that all of our countries have committed to, requires urgently the mobilization of both public and private financing. Globally, about $4.55 billion would be required, trillion dollars, apologies, by 2030 in order to be able to meet those goals. And it is particularly the funding gap that we are hoping to close, working with the public and private sectors in order to mobilize significant amounts of capital or to redirect these amounts from carbon-intensive activities in order to meet these objectives. And in so doing, as part of this ecosystem of funding needs, this is where the taxonomies enter into play. As you can see from this slide, currently, globally, there are more than 35 taxonomy projects worldwide. Now, what are taxonomies? As you can see here, they are public financial policy instruments, not just geared towards investors, but also towards companies in order to identify those activities that could be green or sustainable activities, making it possible to redirect investments and portfolios towards financial institutions and companies so that they effectively understand the delineation of their investments and how this can tie in with sustainability. Here you can see a number of examples. The first taxonomies that were developed worldwide, for instance, the European Union taxonomy, but we can also see China, Indonesia too, and in Latin America, for instance, Colombia has developed one. And these ecosystem that was developed in 2022, and which was published by the Mexican government, is the Sustainable Green Taxonomy. Unlike the other taxonomies, elsewhere in the world, the Mexican taxonomy is defined by a dual approach. From the outset, it addresses not only environmental and social objectives, and this is specifically with the purpose of ensuring that Mexico is able to close these gaps or divides that I referred to earlier. The federal government clearly understands that we will not be able to decrease vulnerability of individuals and of strategic infrastructure in our country with a view to climate change without, first of all, closing these social gaps. And in general terms, as has been said, these taxonomies are going to make it possible for both investors as well as for companies to redirect their portfolios in order to embark on a path towards sustainability. Next slide. In order to design the sustainable taxonomy in Mexico, this was the result of a participatory, broad-ranging, systematic work, bringing on board not just the public sector, but also the private sector too, with input from academia, international organizations, civil society organizations, who worked together in order to be able to design and identify this list of activities based on which investors, not just nationally but also internationally, who are interested in investing in Mexico, can gear their investments towards sustainability. First off, there was a selection of 120 economic activities in 6 key sectors of the Mexican economy. Here it's important to note that this list of activities and this list of sectors were identified based on their additionality and that they contribute towards the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, as well as in order to comply with the Sustainable Development Goals on behalf of the Mexican government also. A number of goals defined by the Mexican government, other goals which were transposed in order to identify and select these activities. As I said earlier, in our department, efforts were made in order to address social objectives too. And as such, we developed a gender equality index, which we'll look at more closely later on. Next slide, please. Sustainable taxonomy provides a guide for financial institutions and companies in order to identify the sustainable activities based on both solid technical criteria, which are designed by experts who participated in the design of this taxonomy. There are various benefits as a result, and it is also targeting various users. For instance, among the identified benefits are the following. The taxonomy seeks to provide a minimum standard for the market so as to ensure that these activities will lead to benefits for the environment and for society as a whole, so as to be able to mobilize financing not only to address social aspects but also to tackle environmental aspects by creating policy instruments of the highest quality. It also creates an environment, a conducive environment, providing certainty and security in the market in order to be able to thus consolidate our transformation of the Mexican financial system. Among the main users of this new taxonomy, we have real sector companies, as you can see here, stock market issuers, companies that use these services on a daily basis, credit institutions, both banks and credit institutions who can also use this taxonomy in order to manage their portfolio, create and move new instruments that are deemed sustainable, and then also institutional investors. This can be pension funds, investment funds, insurance companies, not only seeking to transform their day-to-day activities and assets, but also serving to identify these activities that they wish to invest in based on their sustainability and with a view to reducing climate change-related risk. Next slide. Unlike other taxonomies that are being developed elsewhere in the world, the Mexican sustainable taxonomy is unique at a global level for the following reasons, because it addresses these two aspects, environmental and social aspects. In its first phase, the taxonomy addresses mitigation and climate change adaptation objectives. Meeting mitigation and adaptation goals through the identification of 124 activities in 6 sectors such as agriculture, forestry, water and energy, manufacturing industry, transport, construction, and waste management issues. Alongside focusing on gender equality, a gender equality index was created for the use by companies in order to bring about changes in the 6 sectors that have been identified and help close these social gaps. First of all, ensuring dignified work, ensuring well-being for women in the workplace, and ensuring social inclusion of women in the workplace. Next slide, please. Now, how to ensure the compliance requirements of the sustainable taxonomy and to ensure that they are truly sustainable. We have a process that has been identified based on the development of technical criteria. For these investors who are seeking to align their activities with the sustainable taxonomy, they first of all need to guarantee the eligibility of their activities, meaning identifying which activities are already listed among the 124 activities that were identified in our taxonomy. These are the eligible activities. Secondly, the need to guarantee that these activities are aligned with the technical criteria and with the thresholds that are established under this taxonomy in order to truly guarantee that this is leading to a substantial contribution not only towards mitigation goals but also towards adaptation goals. Thirdly, institutions and companies need to be able to guarantee that they are not creating any significant harm, that they're contributing to sustainable development through this taxonomy. And this is something that is underway in the efforts of the Mexican government in order to ensure avoidance of harm to biodiversity, to our waters, waste production, reducing air pollution, etc. And then finally, these projects also need to uphold a number of minimum safeguards that are social in nature. These minimum safeguards are geared towards guaranteeing the human rights and labor rights across the range of projects. For that purpose, the Mexican government, along with a number of experts, has taken into account both the principles and recommendations issued by the United Nations, the OECD, as well as the ILO, amongst others. Next slide, please. As you can see here, the next steps, it has been decided that based on market needs, there are a number of steps that need to be taken. First off, to focus on capacity building for companies and financial institutions to start aligning their projects with this new taxonomy. We are therefore in the process of developing a tool, an online tool on the taxonomy, which is made available to the institutions in the financial system. Subsequently, there will be specific training sessions involved for each type of entity, and we are also in the process of designing a pilot project with input from selected representative entities from the financial system in order to participate in backtesting as to how to implement the taxonomy in Mexico. Thirdly, we are also developing a roadmap in a form of a regulation so that the taxonomy can be implemented first of all on a voluntary basis and subsequently as a mandatory process. It's important to note that this is an ESG regulation, and will also be aligned with the criteria and principles that were recently published. Fourthly, the development of other environmental and social objectives. As I said earlier, the Mexican taxonomy at the first stage is addressing these three goals: mitigation, adaptation, and gender equality. However, upon the identification of other market needs and other public policy needs that will be addressed through the taxonomy, the next steps to be taken in the future will be geared towards meeting those goals, such as biodiversity, social inclusiveness, reducing air pollution, and ensuring sustainable cities, which are other significant policy issues for the Mexican government, which we are seeking to address through this taxonomy. And fifthly, as you can see here, periodic updates, as well as evaluations or assessments of the taxonomy. Ultimately, the taxonomy is a living instrument, a financial instrument, and always linked or associated with the current state of our technological development and market needs. And so on a regular basis then, these periodic updates or assessments will take place to ensure that the taxonomy is still able to respond to the market needs and activities. Next slide, please. That brings me to the end, and I see from the chat that I just have a minute left. So simply to let you know that this is the process currently underway in Mexico in order to start work on further strengthening and aligning mobilization of public and private capital towards sustainability. Here you find the link with our documentation. And again, if you have any additional questions or comments, you can send them by email to the email address that you see before you on the screen.
So much, Gabriela. That's terrific. And the basis for at least the disclosure element of that Mexican domestic legal framework that Gabriela just outlined to us derives in part from a voluntary initiative, an industry initiative launched in 2015, the same year as the Paris Agreement, which was called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, the TCFD. There is now the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, the TCND, TNFD, too many acronyms. And the TCFD's not only informed the Mexican legal framework, but also the EU, Singapore, Canada, Japan, South Africa, the UK from 2050, and New Zealand from 2023. Not many countries, Gabriela listed 6 that have similar taxonomies, or the EU being a region with many countries. But it's still nowhere near the 197 member states of the Paris Agreement. So between the international voluntary sort of initiatives and standard setting and how that morphs into national legal frameworks, I think is a really important area that we can learn lessons from. So to that, our second speaker is Chris Nathaniel, and Chris is from the International Organization of Securities Commissions. That's IOSCO, the body that brings together the world's securities regulators, and it is recognized as a global standard setter for that sector. So Chris leads IOSCO's work on sustainable finance and in relation to sustainability reporting, carbon markets, ESG data, and ratings providers in particular. And prior to that, she was 4 years at the UK Financial Conduct Authority. So she's incredibly well qualified to take us now through the existing lay of the land in terms of voluntary disclosure and the growing body of how that voluntary disclosure is morphing into mandatory rules and what efforts are underway at a global level to standardise those mandatory rules. Over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. And thanks, everyone, for having me here. It's an honor, so thank you very much. As I was listening to some of the sessions this morning, as well as what Gabriela has just said, for me there is one key theme that keeps coming back, and it is the balance between private and public, and particularly the time at which that balance needs to shift from one to another. Now, at the outset, I should flag IOSCO is, of course, a public organization. Our members are securities commissions from all your jurisdictions. We have over 190 countries representing 95% of securities markets. So very much a public focus when it comes to securities markets. We set out standards, and your commissions then, working with you, look to implement those in one shape or form to fit domestic purposes, of course. In that role and in financial markets generally, I think finding that balance between private and public and the appropriate time at which you do so is particularly important. So it's a daily battle for us to think about at what point should financial regulation, should public law bite. But perhaps it's particularly critical when we start thinking about sustainable finance and the shift towards the transition to net zero. Because let us make no mistake, yes, we need private finance to transition our economies towards net zero. Governments on their own will not be able to find the funding that is necessary. No, we can't leave those decisions without any oversight to the financial sector, because that same sector has shown us in the past that left without any oversight, they perhaps make decisions that are not always aligned with societal objectives. IOSCO has key priorities when it comes to sustainability at the moment. Wendy has mentioned some of them. And as I go through some of those priorities, I will try to show you how we seek to achieve that balance and where we feel the time has come now for public action, moving from private initiatives. And perhaps when we start thinking about non-state actors, there is no better place to start than the type of disclosures that those actors provide to the market, but also to broader stakeholders. So we'll start with corporate disclosures, and I think it is obvious to say those corporate disclosures up until now haven't been to the levels we might have expected from them. Private initiatives have led us to an alphabet soup of disclosure requirements, making corporate disclosures uncomparable, inconsistent, and incomplete. And this has led to an increase in cases where judges have been asked to opine on whether those disclosures were appropriate, whether the disclosures were insufficient, and they have been asked to side with the corporate or with the investor or the type of stakeholder, decisions that I am told they are finding day by day increasingly difficult to make. In 2021, IOSCO decided the time had come to take a stand, and we called for the establishment of the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, under the umbrella of the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, IFRS. Now, many of you will be familiar with IFRS, as the vast majority of financial reporting across the globe now follows those standards. As I said, we felt the situation had become untenable, so when the ISSB was finally established, we worked closely with them through the development of the standards that they have now published as final, and our role now will shift from working with them, trying to get them on that journey so that corporates across the globe can use those disclosures once they're implemented in jurisdictions, to actually reviewing those standards and making our own decision as to whether we feel those standards are fit for purpose for capital markets. Now, that's a historical moment if it happens, because if IOSCO give its green light to the ISSB standards, that essentially gives jurisdictions such as yourselves the signal that you can consider implementing, applying, or being informed by the ISSB standards, and therefore moving sustainability reporting to the same level where financial reporting is now, from private to public requirements. But of course, disclosure on its own is not sufficient. The reverse of this is that the readers of those reports need to have faith in what the reports are saying. In the same way as we seek to avoid another Enron scandal in financial reporting, it may be appropriate to try and avoid that when it comes to sustainability reporting as well. So for assurance, or ESG auditing, for lack of a better word, at the moment those auditing requirements are being undertaken by auditors, your typical auditing firms, but also by new ESG assurance providers. And at the moment, it is fair to say that they're not really abiding by any sort of standards, which means that the assurance that investors and other stakeholders are receiving are once again incomparable, inconsistent, and there are question marks raised about the quality of the assurance service provided. Given the size of the market nowadays, given the importance of climate and sustainability reporting more generally to society, to investors, and to jurisdictions, we believe the time is now right to move the audit framework for ESG once again from private oversight to public oversight. So IOSCO published a report in March 2023 asking the auditing standard setters, the International Accounting and Auditing Standards Board, and the International Ethics Standards Board to develop the standards for assurance that we would hope could, over time, provide the same role that the ISSB standards will play. And when we published our report, we asked for 3 things. The first was those standards should be profession agnostic. At the moment, not only auditors are providing those services, so everybody that provides ESG assurance should abide to the same level of quality. Number 2, they should be framework agnostic. Whether jurisdictions implement ISSB standards as they were, or whether jurisdictions start putting in place their own framework, learning from the ISSB standards, the auditing standards should be able to bite. And finally, the time is now. They should be timely. Those standards should be ready for application for end 2024 accounts, so that in 2025, the assurance providers can use those standards when they make their reports. At IOSCO, we generally believe bringing this type of certification into a regulatory context will give it the rigor it requires for investors to have faith in the disclosures they are seeing, something which at times has been lacking up until now. But corporate disclosures on their own, once again, are not sufficient. The question of certification and the tension between public and private is also starting to appear in other sectors. And perhaps none more so than in the carbon markets, and specifically in the offset credit markets, a topic that you already discussed this morning, a sector that is so far unregulated and for the most part, and a sector that has remained within the confine of private law when issues tend to appear. We've heard it in discussions this morning, carbon markets, both compliance emission trading schemes as well as voluntary offset credit schemes, are a necessary tool in the transition towards net zero. Emission trading schemes are important because they remove emissions, but offset credit schemes are important because not all emissions at the moment can be removed from the atmosphere. Not all of them are avoidable. But for those markets to function and to play the role that is assigned to them, they need integrity. Verifiers and certifiers at the moment in the offset credit market are private entities who have set out criteria for the quality of the credits, who use their own methodologies that are not always compatible, and who are at the moment not subject to any oversight. This has led to questions, rightly so in my opinion, about the environmental integrity of those offset credits, and particularly the projects that underpin those offset credits. We've seen recent work at private level through the ICVCM. I know Annette spoke to you this morning, to establish a common framework that can, if needed in the future, be built upon from a public policy perspective, but which at this moment in time should hopefully start filling the integrity gaps that we are seeing in the offset credit markets. Scandals have already happened. Let us be clear. They cannot keep happening. They are not an option for this market if it is to build up. But carbon markets also require financial integrity to function properly. What do we mean by that? Well, perhaps 3 key things. Clarity on the legal nature, an issue which I know once again you have discussed this morning, but which is causing a lot of strain in the market and a lot of questions. Clarity around the accounting of the credits, an issue which hopefully the ISSB standards will play an initial role in clarifying. And then finally, and I put on my securities regulators cap on here, transparency and prevention of market abuse. A clean market with market participants who obey specific rules as they would in any other financial market. Carbon markets to me is perhaps a ripe example for the time being, where that tension between public and private has not reached culmination point yet, where both approaches are valid and can complement one another for the time being. The work ICVCM has been doing on environmental integrity is encouraging, and we will need to see how it continues developing. But on financial integrity, both on legal nature and on-market behaviors, it is clear the pendulum has moved towards more clarity by public authorities if those markets are to scale. The time is now. IOSCO will seek to play its part. Some governments have already moved. We are seeing voluntary carbon markets being built up with the help of governments. and that is particularly the case in emerging markets. The likes of this Commission also have a huge role to play, and we are looking to collaborating with you at any point if necessary. In the interest of time today, I focused on those aspects that I see as vital and that I think align with the agenda of the discussion, but I could raise a number of other examples where that balance is important. Green bonds are currently mostly underpinned by private criteria. But we're seeing public authorities moving into that space, particularly out of concerns around the issue of use of proceeds. Investment funds are slowly being brought into regulatory framework on the sustainability disclosure aspect, because we have realized that sometimes they market themselves as climate or ESG funds when perhaps they shouldn't be doing so. Financial markets are, in short, full of those examples where the balance between private and public is key to success for climate financing. And as public authorities, we need to find the right time to act, to promote those markets and ensure the investors in those markets are safeguarded, but at the same time as we are doing that, not stifle the markets to the point where they no longer play the important role they must play. That balance, that tipping point, is a daily battle, as I mentioned earlier. Hopefully together we can find some solutions without causing collateral damage. We can bring trust, and we can do everything we can in the trust that we have shifted the fight, at least a little bit, in the right direction. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was really excellent. So we have now in mind, from our first two speakers, Gabriella and Chris, the emerging legal framework through national law and regulation, but also the converging standards, bringing us to that very recent work of the ISSB. And in due course, we might hope to see those ISSB standards integrated into those domestic law frameworks, very much like the international accounting standards are integrated into national domestic corporate laws or company acts. If we can have one global set of accounting standards for cash, why not for carbon? So we're going to pivot now from the lawmakers and the standard setters to our next two speakers who will take us closer into those who are operating within these frameworks. So we're going to start by welcoming Maurizio Morocosta, who's the co-founder and CEO of BV Rio Institute. He's also the co-founder and COO of Sustainable Investment Management, and that's a company dedicated to developing, financing and managing environmental financing programs. So previously he was a regional director for Eco Securities in Brazil, and that's a world-leading carbon markets company, and prior to that a commercial lawyer in both Brazil and Portugal. So he covers a range of stakeholders. Maurizio, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you, Wendy. I'd like to thank you for the invitation to participate in this important conference and to share my experience on certification in green investment. So, just as Wendy mentioned, my experience is more related to carbon markets and financial structures, and developing in the financial structures to fund sustainable programs. I've been working on that. I'm a lawyer by education, by the way, but the first 15 years of my career were dedicated to international law firms, and about 20 years ago I made this career shift, so I've been working in this space for about 20 years, and it is from this perspective that I think I could contribute a little bit with this debate here. So talking about certification, certification is mostly needed when there is an important asymmetry of information among the stakeholders, and which is clearly the case of climate change. So you have something to be certified, the standards that you use to certify the certifier. So there are multiple initiatives, both public and private, working on climate change certification standards, principles, reporting, etc. I'm not intending to comment on each of them, but just to mention some, to give you an idea. We have in market standards, very good standards, the old CDM. You have the ESG principles for investments, principles for responsible investments, the ICMA, the International Capital Market Association, principles for green bonds, several reporting standards, some of them mentioned here already, but you have the Global Resources Institute, the Task Force for Climate-related financial disclosures, the ISSP, already mentioned, JG Protocol, CDP, ISO, the EU directives, and also certification of green bonds from climate bonds initiatives, contemplating various sectors of the economy. You have as well the underlying activities being certified, and given my experience with land use, I would mention the certification from roundtables for sustainable soy, sustainable palm oil, sustainable cattle ranching, so on and so forth. And also initiatives to align definitions like the Accountability Framework Initiative, the High Conservation Value definitions, and even the SBTI, the Science-Based Target Initiatives. Just to mention that there are lots of initiatives going on, all of them highly recognized, both technically and in terms of governance, many of them complementary to each other, and they refer to each other as well. So there is a full cosmology of activities and initiatives in this space. And the question I would like to raise is the certification schemes delivering what they are supposed to? And with the question, basically, what they are expected to deliver. And, well, I'm not talking about they are for legal compliance or voluntary purpose, but in both cases, and from this perspective that I would like to bring here, certification is used in commercial or financial transactions to inform business decisions, and this is referred to in companies' financial and environmental reports, as already mentioned already. And are they delivering well? Well, I personally believe that to a large extent, yes, the certification schemes have a fundamental role in promoting guidance and confidence on the certified activities, right? So it helps in several ways, and just to mention for society in general, society in general, and providing the society a reliable reference of what are the right things companies should do, and in principle that those companies are doing what they are certified. But for companies in general, this is important to give a guidance of what they should do, so they can respond to society's expectations and to enhance or to preserve the public image, and as well to be protected against accusations of greenwashing or possibly lawsuits. On the other hand, what I would like to point out as well is carbon market certification schemes are not delivering, they are delivering quality, even if it's sometimes challenged, but they are not delivering the quantity needed, the volume required to face the 1.5 degrees imperative. So there's a huge bottleneck in the existing systems, which are very much dependent on a bureaucratic approach designed 30 years ago, and yet not incorporating the benefits of the new technologies, for instance. So at the same time, those schemes are under attack. There is a great pressure from society for companies to take action to reduce their climate impact, and in respect to the schemes, the certification schemes, there are a lot of powerful campaigns. We saw every other day some denouncers in the Guardian article the other day, etc., which are important to keep the pressure for improvements. But it's important to point out as well that these campaigns may also they have the potential to inhibit investors and companies to engage in climate change mitigation activities. And given that, how the sector is reacting to that. So in general, the carbon market sector is feeling the pressure They are seeking to provide the market with some response to that, and the buzzword is integrity. So you have these initiatives like the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiatives, the VCMI, the Integrity Council for Voluntary Markets, also a sectoral initiative, the ICVCM, which are working on more strict requirements and conditions to deliver, and I quote, the highest degree of integrity, which obviously is needed and must be promoted. The integrity is important, but maybe alone it will not be enough to deliver the large-scale changes which are required. So, on the contrary, by definition, when we have stricter rules, there are less candidates that are eligible. So, it's important to be aware of possible backlashes or paradoxical effects or perverse effects that could result in good emission reduction projects, for instance, not being able to comply with the new regulations or not contemplated with standards. There is the risk of creating barriers. If the bar is too high, it risks that less companies will be able or even willing to engage, and consequently it may result in a reduction on the overall funding for climate action, and obviously a reduction on the overall impact of climate action initiatives. So, the enhancement of quality, which is needed and required, shouldn't be detrimental to the large-scale impact needed. So it needs to be rigorous in assuring integrity, but at the same time, it needs to be inclusive. On the words of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, it needs to be ambitious, but also, and I quote, practical for near-term adoption or adoptable, and at the end of the day, to allow an increase of investment flows. This is not an easy discussion, as it sounds a bit weird. It sounds like I'm preaching against integrity or regulation, which absolutely is not the case. On the very contrary. But as a director friend of mine of one of the main international environmental NGOs said, and I quote again, "The unattainable best is always more attractive than the attainable compromise." And this is a real risk. Already mentioned by my colleagues of the panel, the balance, it's recognized even by the very companies or the very organizations that are saying, which are working on the integrity things like, well, the CBI, the climate bonds initiatives. They are working on transition bonds. The ISO proposed interim targets. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure proposes adoptable standards, and VCMI just commissioned a study to find the right balance between ambition and accessibility and possible flexibilization of their own rules. So my point in mentioning this is not to criticize the integrity initiatives, which I support, as I said, and not to minimize the importance of regulation, but rather to illustrate the conceptual difficulties and challenges that are involved in the sort of strategical decisions that must be made. So back to the certification schemes and standards, and as a final remarks here, certification schemes and standards are important and very much needed, as climate action requires a safe space for mainstream large-scale investment flows. Together with command and control, regulation and certification, it is an important tool to provide these conditions. At the same time, it's important to preserve some friendly space for innovative investment structures and initiatives being able to accommodate and potentially combine initiatives that bring different types of source of capital, the so-called blended finance. All these questions are constantly changing due to technical and conceptual issues. They are evolving according to science and governance as they should, but they are also subject to public pressure, and we know that passionate discussions may not lead to the right decisions. So, all in all, there's a plurality of reliable organizations actively working on several aspects of the cosmology of the climate change certification in a reporting world. Harmonization is really desirable, and it's important to mention, although, that as a rule, there is a mutual recognition among the various schemes. They do mutual reference one to each other in the cases of direct contribution, and harmonization efforts are already in place among several of them. That said, it's important to progress in this space. So these are just a few thoughts that I would like to share and maybe contribute to the debate on the UNCITRAL role in this subject. And I stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mauricio. So don't let perfect be the enemy of good, and lots going on, but still that lack of harmonization. So Tatiana, our final speaker, Tatiana Snia Alves, she's a sector lead for Green Finance Inter-American Development Bank. Tatiana's an economist, senior sustainable finance professional. Oh, I should have said before that, apologies to those of you in the room who lost the interpretation, that the sound quality wasn't able to be interpreted, so our apologies. So Tatiana has a broad Latin American experience in private finance, philanthropy, academia, consulting, impact investment, as well as multilateral finance, so represents our broad range of stakeholders in this important topic. Now, she's particularly perfect person to complete our scene setting because she was named in a Brazilian magazine as one of the 50 climate innovators in Brazil in 2021. So let's hear from Tatiana. Looking forward.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Thank you very much also, Angelo, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you all about the important topic of standardization in the space of carbon markets. Very pleased to be here with my fellow panelists. I'm here representing the IDB. I'm the sector lead for green finance, and we at the IDB have been working very closely with governments in the Latin American region and the Caribbean for several years on climate action. And since the COP in Paris, we have been supporting countries in developing their NDCs that are anchored in the Paris Agreement, and now also in the implementation efforts of these NDCs. Therefore, we're really a key partner, technical partner, financial partner to these countries. We have also forged over the years several strategic collaborations with donor countries that have been successfully delivering on helping to mainstream the topic of climate change in various countries' dialogues, and also supporting them on the financial side, developing and deploying innovative financial products to further catalyze investments into a low carbon and resilient economy. We have several examples of different financial instruments that we have been implementing in the region, and more recently, more and more, we have been having a lot of demands from the countries in the region that we cover on how can we support them with technical cooperation and obviously with finance as well in activities that could generate carbon credits, emission reductions or removals. As you all know, Latin America, specifically the Amazon region, could be a large source of generating emission reductions and removals. And countries in the region, they really want to position themselves so that they are able to offer a range of emission reductions or removals to other countries, particularly via the Article 6, and how can we at the IDB support them in that transition, as well as how can we support them with financial mechanisms to actually be able to provide the upfront capital that is necessary to invest in these kinds of activities. All of that said, obviously has to do a lot with, how can the frameworks be implemented in the region so that they're able to provide reliable removals or reduction in emissions to either their other domestic sectors that are being capped by local national policies, or other countries that are, looking forward to actually engaging with these countries in Latin America in buying carbon credits. So that said, I think that it's a perfect space for me to tell a little bit more about what are the kinds of demands that we are having on the supply side, meaning from countries in Latin American region, on how can we support them in this pathway towards low carbon economy, and also being able to attract the necessary finance to put in place activities that deliver on emission reductions and removals, and at the same time, looking on the demand side of those credits, where we are talking and we are supporting donor countries in identifying what are the good opportunities and how can they as well support countries in Latin America to put in place the necessary frameworks, the standards that are needed, so that there is a transparent value chain of carbon that they can actually access them. So on the supply side of carbon credits, IDB has been supporting countries and understanding, the issues of Article 6. What does it take to be able to create this additional revenue stream that could support projects in the region on emission reductions and removals? Again, Latin America could be, it is very well positioned to be a supplier of nature-based solutions. Carbon credits originated from nature-based solutions. And based on that, these countries really want to understand, and this really bridges a little bit of the discussions that we were having earlier this morning with the other panelists. They really want to understand what are the pros and cons on the legal definition of what is the thing, what is the carbon that they are going to be generating, carbon emission, carbon removal, and what does that mean in terms of the thing that is going to be sold either domestically or internationally. Moreover, they really want to have our support to design the regulations, what are the processes that are allowed to create these carbon offsets, what are the issues regarding, regional, intra-country jurisdiction, and broadly, regional jurisdiction, meaning for more than one country generating these credits via Article 6. They also need, and I think this actually I should have said from the beginning, they really need support on capacity building to actually navigate through all these processes and really be able to understand what are the issues related to the carbon value chains that they will be generating at the end of the pipeline that could be engaged in Article 6 with other countries. Also, they will need a clear view on how they can actually be supported in terms of engaging in bilateral discussions with countries that are looking to source credits from these countries. Then on the demand side of carbon credits, meaning countries that are looking at how they can best engage with the countries in Latin American region in sourcing credits, initially set voluntary carbon credits, but how can these voluntary carbon credits then be used for compliance purposes in these countries via Article 6? They really want to better understand what are the legal frameworks that are being discussed in these countries so that they have a better certainty on, what is the legal and the environmental as well integrity of these carbon credits that they could eventually be buying and eventually also be providing the upfront finance for the generation of these credits. They also need to understand what are the certification mechanisms that countries are going to vouch for so that these credits are actually credits that will be counted against the country's NDCs, that they will have the needed environmental integrity and that they can be sold to them to meet their own NDCs. I think that those are sort of the basic issues that we have been facing recently on the discussions that we're having with either donor countries but also with countries in the Latin American region. And last but not least, I think it's also important to illustrate that some of the blended finance mechanisms that we have in the bank, for instance, the Amazon Bioeconomy Fund, which is a blended finance fund with IDB and the Green Climate Fund, where we are able to provide long-term financing for public financial institutions so that they are able to support bioeconomy activities in the region. Those clients of ours, these public financial institutions that are also very much aligned with their governments in moving forward policies related to carbon markets, they want to understand how these opportunities that they are identifying on the ground in terms of financing bioeconomy-based projects are actually going to also deliver on carbon credits and how they can support these producers or these SMEs in the region in putting in place, projects related to bioeconomy that also are going to generate carbon credits that could also benefit from the opportunity that Article 6 has in terms of additional revenue streams for these projects. So in essence, public financial institutions in the region of Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Suriname, Ecuador that we're working with, for instance, they want to understand how can they navigate the subject of carbon markets and how they can really understand what will be the value chain and how the certification will work in these value chains so that they're able to also generate these additional thing or asset to be discussed so that their clients that are borrowing from them are able to strengthen their projects with an additional revenue stream. I think that with that, I'll leave it at here and hand over back to you, Wendy.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. And Angelo, if I'm right, we've got 10 minutes for questions. Okay, do we have any questions from anybody here? I don't see immediately. So if we don't have any questions online, none? Okay. All right. So I have a question. So having heard from those four speakers, what I'd really like to ask each one of them is, having heard all four of the contributions together, where to each of you, where within your area of expertise, do you think there may be gaps, additional gaps, suitable for UNCITRAL in particular to explore? So we'll start with Gabriella. Now, have I got more time? Okay. Because we didn't use all our time, did we? Doesn't matter. Okay, we'll start with the speakers in the room. It may be that our speakers online, because of the interpretation time, need to answer in the chat. So, Chris.
Thanks, Wendy. It's a bit of a tricky question, but I think as we think about all the harmonizing efforts that are currently underway around the question of data, disclosure, etc., it is one thing for a company to disclose and to have the public reporting associated with that but they are bilateral relationships that really are maintained through contracts that tend to fall within the private law environment. And I think bringing some of those, or a consideration of how you take those harmonization efforts and reflect them potentially into contracts could be quite useful, because I think there's no question that some of the aspects that are being disclosed are perhaps a bit more challenging to begin with. There are questions around supply chains. There are questions around what you do with Scope 3. How do you get access to that information? To give just a minor example, perhaps not so minor, but that would be a consideration, I would say, that could be quite useful coming out of UNCITRAL.
Okay. So some sort of standard terms okay, very good. Okay, all right, so we can have our online speakers speaking, but before we do, we'll take Tatiana.
Thank you, Andy, for the question. I agree with Chris. It's tricky, but being at the end of the day a financial institution which is the IDB, I think for us it's really important in order that we can really deploy resources and at the end of the day also be able to scale private investments into these activities in the region. It is very key to have mechanisms and even use technologies for that to see through these value chains and how carbon credits are going to be generated. Because if we have the transparency that it's needed in terms of how these credits were originated, how they were sourced, and how they are being delivered, we're able to really scale concessional capital, and from there also scale even more private investments. So without that kind of transparency of the process, also transparency on how what the integrity of these credits are, we're not able to really assess the business case of these projects on the ground, so that we're able to therefore deploy the resources.
Excellent. So capacity building, but also perhaps integrating some of the digital contract work as well. And that in particular gets to the microfinancing more effectively, doesn't it, in the communities? Excellent. So, Gabriela.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Regarding the question, sorry, says the speaker, I can hear myself. Regarding the question, I think that the other panelists already touched on a very important point. It's very important that we start in governments to start strengthening transparency when it comes to the development of these instruments that will allow us to keep ensuring that the instruments and financial activities are correctly defined to help shed any uncertainties regarding taxonomies, but also in order to promote disclosure of information and transparency through regulation. As has been said, another important point to work on from the taxonomy angle is also, against the backdrop of the increased number of taxonomies worldwide, it's important to start reviewing what these instruments consider to be green or sustainable, so that we have interoperability, or at least a minimum standards among the different taxonomies, which in turn will provide the market with greater certainty. And in so doing, this will promote investment internationally among the various markets by applying the same standards, or at least the same minimum standard for all countries. I think that that will be beneficial when it comes to developing these types of instruments, and naturally cooperating with the international organizations in the field such as IOSCO in order to keep strengthening transparency and disclosure requirements, not only on the part of the companies, but also as regards the financial institutions.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Gabriela. So interagency cooperation, but also the harmonisation of the national laws, that legislative guidance, model laws are instruments known well to UNCITRAL. Mauricio.
Hello. I've heard that my presentation was not very clear. Sorry for that. I hope this time it works a little better. So very briefly, of course, UNCITRAL will be invited to participate in those in these activities and provide some. You have to rely or to refer to certification standards, so on and so forth. So my comment on that is that UNCITRAL should, in my view, put its efforts towards harmonization, but refraining itself from the creation of new rules of standards, but rather to rely or to defer to the existing ones and participate in possibly in the harmonization efforts. And as mentioned by Chris before, I think it's important to adopt an agnostic approach related to the existing frameworks and be flexible enough for the different schemes to be used. So I will say that.
Thank you so much, Mauricio. And that's a really important, I think, warning to us all. There is frankly no time for climate change to reinvent the wheel, and there's also no need. So taking the work that's being done and really amplifying it and getting it to the corners of the community where it needs to go. Maurizio, to be clear, your English was perfectly clear in the room. It was just those relying on translations that I think had a little bit of difficulty. So I do have lots more questions, but I only have a minute, so I don't dare. But were there any from the room? We don't have any from the room or online. Have I got? Oh, yes.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, and congratulations to all the speakers for their interesting insights on this. As I was listening to what Chris said, and also in the light of the remarks that Mauricio made, and I was thinking of the architecture of the program. I cannot explain it as well as you explained the architecture of this panel, because I think I lack that talent. But something that I've heard in the preparation, the conception of the colloquium was comments about the fear or the freezing effect that conflicting or inconsistent or discrepant standards combined with in growing climate law litigation that is taking place on the basis of general principles of law, human rights, tort law standards, without some sort of a clear parameter as to the extent of liability exposure of both of certifying companies, but also companies or entities that make voluntary commitments may have a freezing and chilling effect on their willingness or appetite for making voluntary commitments for the future. And here, when I think that use this same word that was used for the first presentation, when Gabriela talked about the climate taxonomy in Mexico, and I think the possible usefulness of a taxonomy of the business and private law implications of certification schemes and discrepancy of standards. UNCITRAL would never develop standards for this as such, but bringing to the attention of legislators the business law implications of standards and the consequence of the compliance of that, and as part of the integral legislative framework for a proper implementation of the Paris Agreement, whether that was not something that might be worthwhile considering at a certain point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angelo. So that leaves us to say thank you again to our speakers online and here in person, and thank you to you all for your attention in this witching hour after lunch. We much appreciate it.
thanks to the discipline of this panel, we have, I would say, shortly less than 15 minutes for a refreshments break, and I'll be back here at 15:30 for the last session. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could kindly take your seats, and it allow us to resume our colloquium with today's last panel. It might have become apparent already to you the way we structure the program of the colloquium after a general overview of the policy framework and the brilliant keynote speech by Annette Nazareth. And we had a first overview of illegal issues coming out of voluntary carbon markets, but not only, and then issues related to certification. And now we pick up from possibly a slightly more technical legal point of view one topic that was already anticipated, especially in the remarks made by Peter Werner representing ISDA, and that is in particular the question of legal nature of carbon credits as financial instruments. You have noticed also that we have not strictly separated voluntary from compliance markets in that, because it is our view, at least a preliminary one, that the actual legal issues that come up relating to the legal nature of these instruments are the same regardless of whether a market is a compliance market or voluntary market. Is just that the way they are defined and the rule of contract is that, and that would vary. And so for the last panel of the day, we have 4 speakers, and I would introduce them to you in the order that they will be speaking. And I'll simply also like, before I do that, to point out that this, as we heard from the Mexican taxonomy, that not only climate change but also other social goals such as gender are important. I'd simply like to stress that we're not scoring badly in terms of gender balances. The colloquiums have seen, out of 33 speakers, we have 18 female speakers, and it's a pleasure for us to have such an important participation of female colleagues in our colloquium. So thank you all in particular for that. So the first speaker in our panel is Professor Géraud de la Suisse-Angéniez. Professor de la Suisse-Angéniez is assistant professor at Law Faculty of Laval University in Quebec. He holds an LLM from Panthéon-Sorbonne and a PhD from both Laval and Panthéon-Sorbonne University in France. And Professor de la Suisse-Angéniez is also the consultant that essentially prepared the studies that UNCITRAL, that the Secretariat submitted to UNCITRAL last year and also this year to assist its deliberations. He will be then followed. I'll introduce all the speakers in one go and then just invite them to speak. He'll be followed by Professor Xiaoping Zhang. Professor Zhang is Associate Professor of Law at the Central University of Finance and Economics of Beijing, China, and Director of that University Research Center for Chinese Environmental and Financial Law, and also serves as standing member of Council and Deputy Secretary of the China Energy Law Institute. Then we have, originally we had in program, as you see in the printed version, Mr. Diego Mauricio Herrera Falla from the Inter-American Development Bank. He could not join us here, and Tatiana Alves has kindly agreed to deliver his message, the message he would have delivered to this panel. And Tatiana has already been introduced by Wendy, but as you know, she's a senior sustainable finance professional with broad experience in Latin America and currently working with the Inter-American Development Bank. And then last but not least, and this was the particular welcome addition to our program today, is that Lisa DeMarco is also joining us. She is the CEO and senior part of the Resilient LLP, a boutique climate change law firm that serves global clients, and she's also currently the chair of the International Emissions Trading Association, IETA, so we'll welcome her to our panel. So with that, without further ado, each of the speakers has about 13 minutes. I'll give the floor to Professor de la Suze-Saint-Geniès. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. So I'll be speaking in French if you want to adjust the translation. Permettez-moi tout d'abord de...
I'd like to begin by expressing my very warmest thanks to the Secretariat of the Commission for having invited me and for having involved me over the past few months in this entire process of reflection on carbon credits and climate change and the role that the Commission could play here. So it's been a privilege for me to have been requested to prepare 2 reports on this topic. It's a very important topic indeed because international trade law definitely has a role to play in facilitating the implementation of the objectives of the Paris Agreement. There are a number of ways in which international trade law could support the Paris Agreement, but for the purpose of this panel, I would like to mention just one in particular, which is frequently mentioned by doctrine and by practitioners, and that would involve creating more predictability and legal security in international trade in carbon credits. And we do that by reducing uncertainty that can result from the fact that at the current time, the legal institution of carbon credits is not readily identifiable. So I'm using the term carbon credits in its broadest possible term. It would include credits in the voluntary market and credits in the compliance market alike. So what is the problem? Well, in the context of a market, regardless of what that market is, it's important that participants should know the legal status of what they're buying, because that status will enable them to know what the rules are that apply to the thing that they're buying, what are the rights that they can exercise with respect to the thing, and the obligations that they have when they buy that thing. But with carbon credits, those elements can be very difficult to determine because even if carbon credits are increasingly traded, their legal status is not adequately defined in law. That means that in a situation whereby we have carbon credits that are traded, they are an extraneous element because we may have difficulty anticipating the legal treatment that will be reserved for carbon credits. And as has been stated this morning, this situation is not fostering the development of the carbon market, which should be a key element in financing the climate transition and in implementing the Paris Agreement. So my presentation will look at the issues that arise when we're dealing with carbon credits whose legal status is not defined in international law, and then I will share some observations with respect to certain elements that could be of importance and should be borne in mind if we are going to undertake properly defining the legal status of these credits. With regard to my first point, there are 4 issues that can arise in a jurisdiction where the status of carbon credits is not defined. The first question is whether carbon credits are administrative licenses or subject to property rights. So this question can arise in 2 situations when carbon credits are allocated to an emission trading system. And the second case is when a national authority issues carbon credits as part of a project whose purpose is to absorb greenhouse gases. In this situation, since the credits are issued by the state, we're wondering then whether they are administrative licenses or whether they are assets that are subject to property rights. And that could have implications, because if the credits are administrative licenses, well then that would give greater margin for manoeuvre in the market. The market could revoke the credits that have already been issued, without having to align themselves with expropriation rules. However, if they have property rights, this could give more legal security to market participants. It could increase the market value of the credits and facilitate trade in the credits. The second question would be, are carbon credits to be qualified as tangible or intangible property? Since they do not have any physical existence, they only exist in registries, they're frequently qualified as intangible property. However, some authors are of the view that they should be defined as tangible property, because if you own a credit, what you actually own is a piece of the atmosphere that you can use in order to emit GHGs, greenhouse gases. Also, if the carbon credits have been issued in a project that seeks to capture carbon, then they are attached to a tangible object, which is greenhouse gases. So whether they are tangible or intangible can have legal implications, because that can determine the way in which the credits can be sold, or it can determine the rules that would be applied if the carbon credits are to be used as collateral against a debt. Another issue is whether the owners of carbon credits own a real right over the credits, or whether they own a personal right, a right as a creditor, so to use them, to dispose of them, and so forth. So that would depend on the contract that they have concluded with the private entity that has issued the credit. And this issue arises because in the voluntary market, the creation of a credit is always the result of a relationship between an entity that offers the service of creating carbon credits and an entity that wishes to use that service. So once again, this qualification, or this, whether it's one or the other, can have legal implications. And then the last issue would be whether credits are commodities or if they are financial products. This is an important issue also, because if we consider them to be financial products, then the rules that govern the financial markets would govern enterprises that are involved in the carbon credit markets. For example, they should be registered with a financial market surveillance body. So when the legal status of carbon credits is not properly defined in national jurisdictions, the entities that hold and use those carbon credits can find themselves confronted with different issues, such as how they can sell them, how they can prove ownership of them, what happens with them in the event of bankruptcy or succession, also tax issues, and there may be uncertainties also in terms of how the credits can be used. For example, can they be used as collateral against a debt? So for this reason, many authors today say that in order to facilitate development of the carbon credit markets at the national level and international level, we need to have better predictability in terms of the legal status of carbon credits. This brings me to my next point, which concerns elements that need to be kept in mind in discussion of the legal nature of carbon credits. There are 2 points to be made here. Firstly, if we are to engage ourselves in this undertaking, then we should not focus on just one type of carbon credit. We should focus on all types of carbon credits that will be internationally traded. So that can be voluntary carbon credits and other types of carbon credits that are exchanged among jurisdictions. the best example would be California and Quebec, which have set up a carbon credits market for the past few years. And then we have the IPMOs. These are a form of credit. They were set up under the Paris Agreement. These credits are destined to be exported and used by other states or by corporations in order to compensate their emissions. Just to clarify that the Paris Agreement does not clarify the legal status of the IPMOs, and therefore this is an issue that will need to be addressed in national legislation. In other words, in order to guarantee a certain level of predictability in international trade in carbon credits, we will need to have definition of the legal status of not just one type of carbon credit, but all types. This does not mean that all carbon credits will have the same legal description or qualification in national law, however. A second element, is that in order to clarify the legal status of carbon credits, we also need to look at the context in which carbon credits are created and what can happen, different things that can happen during the existence of carbon credits, because this can also impinge upon the legal treatment of carbon credits in certain situations. To illustrate my point, I'll give you a concrete example of a carbon sequestration project. If the carbon is stored below ground, and if it is stated in that jurisdiction that subsoil resources belong to the government, we can wonder whether the government can exercise certain rights with respect to the credits that have been generated. Another issue that can arise is whether a person who has bought carbon credits has a valid legal title to the credits if the credits have been generated by an enterprise that has captured the carbon in a land plot, for example, in a forest, in which it is not, of which is not the proprietor. So here we have legal issues pertaining to the creation of the carbon credit that can have implications then later down the road. So we need to take on board various things that can arise during the existence of the credits. We can have a situation whereby you discover at a later stage that credits were produced without the rules having been respected, the rules governing the creation of those credits. One way to manage these issues of compliance would be, for example, to prevent a person from using the credits that they own within a registry by blocking their account in the registry until they remedy the issue. So this can give rise to issues at the legal level if carbon credits are considered to have vested within them absolute property rights. So there would be expropriation issues there. So clarifying the legal status of carbon credits is something that needs to be broad, shouldn't be restrictive, and so forth. By way of conclusion, I'd like to say that when you look at the existing literature, you see that there's a very clear demand among authors for more clarity on what carbon credits are and how they should be handled in national legislation. And this gives rise to a question. Do we need just clarification of the law within a jurisdiction? So that would mean that the status will differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Or do we need to have harmonization, uniformization of the legislation in this area, or even a quest for functional equivalence across states? So this question arises because, some states have already clarified the legal status of carbon credits, but not in the same manner. And I would like to stop here and allow the other panelists time to speak also. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for your overview of the general legal status issue and the various jurisdictions and so forth. I would like to give the floor now to our next speaker, Mr. Xiaoping Zhang, who will give us, share with us his experience in one specific market. Thank you.
Thank you. Distinguished Madam Secretary Anna, distinguished Mr. Jose Angelo Estrafaria, dear colleagues. I'm honored to be invited to Colloquium and share my opinions relating to the topic today. I would like to take this opportunity to touch the base of the legal nature of carbon credits. Emission trading is a market-based instrument for combating climate change and controlling emission of greenhouse gases. In the past 2 decades, ETS projects have developed rapidly worldwide. According to the data of the World Bank, at the moment, about 18% of greenhouse gases in the world are currently covered by all kinds of ETS program. More specifically, emission trading is a policy instrument to create a market, which means that the units traded in the carbon markets, whether we call it allowance or carbon credits in its proper sense, are created by the government through law and regulations. For both government or private entities, it is very important to clearly define the legal nature of these units to provide legal security and certainty for carbon markets. At the same time, we find that there are different provisions or approach on this issue. It is true that legal nature of carbon credit should be determined by domestic laws. However, as researchers, we hope to provide a unified theoretical framework to explain the internal logic behind different legal provisions of various countries. The provisions relating to the nature of the carbon credits generally in different jurisdictions may be classified into 3 categories. The first is to define carbon credits as a tradable administrative license granted by the governments. The second is to treat carbon credit as a property right. And the third is to regard carbon credits as financial instrument. Different definitions of the legal nature will lead to different applicable laws. In such a short time, it's hard for me to list all details in legal provisions of different countries, as well as the relevant debates. However, when what we can find quite clearly here is the competition between 2 approaches, the public law approach and private law approach on the legal nature of carbon credit, as well as the choice of putting carbon credit under financial law to avoid such tensions or competitions. In solving problems, the study of comparative law is often instructive and inspiring. However, comparative law study often face such a dilemma. When the provisions of different countries are full of divergence, the traditional strategy of providing justification for domestic law by observing the laws from other countries cannot as effective as expected here, because we look other countries, but other countries look us. But now, if there is divergence, the conclusion cannot be reached very easily. To find a way out of the corner, we need to go beyond static description and look into the dynamic operation of ETS. As we all know, after specifying the coverage of emission trading and setting the cap, the operation of a cap and trade market generally could include the following stage: reporting emission data, third-party verification, allocating allowances or credits, trading, and finally, compliance and the submission of the allowance. Among these 5 stages, there is a significant change from the domination of public law to the domination of private law. Before allocation, or before the registration of carbon allowance in the national registry, in particular, the operation of emission trading market is under direct control of public law. After allocation, emission entities or other qualified participants of the carbon markets can trade according to their own will and benefit from that kind of trade transactions. At this moment, carbon credits reflect a more obvious feature as a right under private law, property law mostly. From the simplified analysis of carbon market operation, we can say that carbon entities have a hybrid nature regarding both public law and private law. This can be verified from the purpose of setting up the ETS to reduce greenhouse gas emission at a lower cost. Reducing greenhouse gas emission is a public goal, but this goal is achieved through market mechanisms to stimulate the participation of private emission entities. The opposition between public law approach and private law approach is actually focused on the different segment of the whole chain of operation of ETS market. Knowing that carbon credits involve both public law and private law, it will come across our minds very naturally that there are several kinds of types of rights which rely both on public law and private law. We may define legal nature of carbon credits by analogy with any of them. Before we move on, it is necessary to emphasize a very crucial feature of carbon credits. In the last stage of the compliance and the submission, emission entities are required to submit carbon credits which is equal to their approved annual emissions. In other words, carbon credits, even treated as right under private law or private property under property right under property law, will cease to be valid after a period of time. Well, we find that carbon credits have both public and private law attributes and will not exist permanently. Reviewing the existing legal system of humankind, which legal category owns such feeders? I think the answer is quite natural and obvious. Intellectual property. Of course, what I must emphasize here is that we see carbon credits is similar to an intellectual property rights. Not that carbon credits are intellectual property. It's just very, very similar to that kind of rights under any legal system. The acquisition process of an IP is dominated by public law, while after acquisition its disposal, including transactions, is governed by private law. Intellectual property rights, including trademarks, patents, and copyrights, can only exist for a certain period of time. After that, it will disappear automatically. Of course, trademark is an exception because it can keep existing by renewal. The goal of IP law system is to stimulate innovation by granting limited monopoly to the private entities. Very similarly, the granting and obtaining process of carbon credits is consequence of the operation of governmental powers, while the transaction of carbon credits can generally be regarded as a process of private autonomy, and carbon credits will disappear after submission and compliance clearance. At the moment, the analogy with intellectual property rights explain the various characteristics of carbon credits in I think solve most of the problem for now. Looking back at the development of human legal system, we know that intellectual property rights initially exist as administrative concessions and then gradually become a civil right. And people found that such right based on innovative intellectual activities could not be covered by property rights or obligation or right in person in civil law, but should be recognized by law as a new emerged independent right. The implication here is carbon credit is also kind of right that cannot be covered by the existing public law or private law system, and it should be provided by law as a new type of right and regulate accordingly, just as we found and recognized intellectual property rights in human history. Before proceeding further, I would like to first explain why carbon credits is regarded as a financial instrument in some countries. As we all know, the intellectual property system emphasizes originality. That is to say, for example, if there are no enough difference between two patents, at least one of them cannot be recognized or protected by law. The situations regarding carbon credits is quite different. Carbon credits are homogeneous. In almost all emission trading systems, a unit of carbon credit is defined as 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. In addition, the emission entity do not need to possess carbon credit physically. They only need to own carbon credits in the account in the virtual way. These two characteristics make carbon credits have the attribute of financial instruments in appearance. This is the reason why carbon credits can be treated and regulated as financial instrument. But what I want to emphasize again is that financial instrument is just outward characteristics of carbon credit in appearance. In essence, carbon credits are not created for the purpose of facilitating capital circulation, swaps, etc., etc. In particular, carbon credits is not a contract itself, but a right in realm, a right against the world at large. Carbon credits are non-permanent rights that is created by the government power and can be traded according to the rules of private law. When using analogy, we should not only see similarities between two things, but also see differences, so that we can get inspiration through an analogy, but not without being misled. I think this provide answer for the possible questions. Since carbon credits have so many similarities with the IP, why not stipulate as IP? In order to prevent misunderstanding and confusion, I would like to point out that the purpose and justification for carbon credits and IP are different. IP are based on the creative activities of enterprises and individuals, and government grant carbon credits to emission entities because although these entities create emissions, but they created for justified purpose, to produce, to circulation, to meet needs, all kinds of needs, satisfy their needs of humankind. This is also important reason why nearly at early stage of all ETS is free allocation, and later on the auction was introduced for better internalized externalities. Let me summarize what I have found so far. Carbon credit is a kind of right that is created for public purpose through government powers, can be treated according to the private law rules, and has a duration. And however, when we use this simplified model to the real world, there are always problems. So we have transaction cost in different legislation, different jurisdiction. We have path independence, and we have boundary rationality, which means it takes time for us to finally realize this is the nature, maybe this is the nature of carbon credits. So in real world, generally, any country is used to put carbon credits under existing legal framework so that do not cause too much troubles, or it seems that there's no structure change in the law. I've due to time, I'll skip the example for China, and I think in real world, if legal system can solve 3 problems, it is acceptable in theory and effective in practice. First is realizing the reduction of GHG greenhouse gas emission for the whole society. This is for public law. Second is providing emission entities with the sufficient incentives to reduce emissions. This is for private part. And finally, you're getting financial sector on board to offer climate finance. This is for financial law. If legal system can solve 3 problems, it does not matter that much how they define carbon credits. If not, then you need to make improvement. So this is the main part of my sharing, and I would like to. You still have time? Okay. Angelo, I kindly tell me that I have 1 or 2 minutes. About the situation in China, let me give you an example. China's laws and regulation remain silent on the legal nature of the carbon credits, but there are pledge. The entities use pledge to get finance from financial sector. But the validity of the contract of the pledge subject to the legal provision of the pledge, you use the credit itself. So when the law remains silent at this point, the financial sector are very worried. So they invented another kind of transaction called the repurchase agreement to replace that kind of pledge transaction. but the problem is that the transaction cost of repurchase agreement is higher than pledge. Finally, this was solved by the judicial interpretation by Supreme People's Court, saying that even because in civil law country we all know that the content and the category of property rights should be provided by law. But Supreme People's Court said even if not provided by law, only if you have registered in proper authority, that contract is valid. So the problem is solved temporarily, but not systematically. So if they can meet three functions can be met, that's fine with your legal system. Finally, I'd like to. I fully understand this is a very simple model. So I welcome all the comments and the questions. And I also need to clarify this in my personal research opinion, not the position of my law school, not the position of my government. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhang, for this yet other different perspective from the ones of being hearing so far, and I think I'm sure there'll be this will provide a little food for thought and discussion. Now, Tatiana, would you present the IDB perspective?
Thank you again, Angelo, for being able to participate in this panel. I'm replacing here my colleague Diego Herrera from IDB. He had to go on a trip to Suriname to address some of the issues there regarding environmental, climate-related matters and transactions that we have there. I think that I would like to start and really listening to the panelists in the morning and then to my colleagues in the previous panel and this panel here. I feel that, people have covered, many of the issues that we see at the bank. And I think it's important to, again, bring the financial sector's perspective. IDB is a multilateral institution. It is providing loans to countries, but also to the private sector via IDB Invest. And it is important for us to be able to work with countries in technical cooperation that will actually enable them to fully benefit from, the possibility of implementing carbon markets as a tool for their NDCs, and in order to do so, also be able to finance these efforts for them to really transition to a low carbon economy, and therefore deploying resources is key, aligned with the policy. So that said, I think that here what we have been seeing in terms of the legal nature of what a carbon credit is and how countries in Latin America can benefit from that is really a demand that countries are putting on the table for us to support them with, which is how can they best navigate the existing legal frameworks that they have, and from there be able to come up with the definition of the legal nature of carbon credits that specifically they could use in Article 6 and therefore be able to attract investments into nature-based solutions, but also other mitigating efforts that they have. And in doing so, in being able to actually support them and navigate through the topic, I think I want to stress here also, so that I don't repeat what my other colleagues said, I want to stress here that defining the legal nature of a carbon credit will actually be very important, so that financial institutions, also the bank, and then the bank catalyzing additional private investors is key, because we are able to have more certainty on what are going to be the revenue flows that can come up from investing in activities that deliver on carbon credits. In addition, it is extremely important to have that definition, because we will know who to enforce in case there is any issue through the value chain of carbon credits. So going back to the issue of the legal frameworks and trying to support countries, what we have been seeing based on their discussions and efforts that we would like to push forward with them is what are the kinds of legal nature that they are considering for these carbon credits that are going to be generated. I think the first one, and Peter has mentioned that, Gerard also has mentioned that here, and other colleagues here in this panel as well. A possibility would be for the carbon credits to be an intangible asset, and some countries do have, a history on, their legal systems to actually use that kind of definition. Other countries are looking at defining the legal nature of carbon credits as a commodity, and we have examples from other emission trading schemes that have been categorizing carbon credits as commodities, and there are benefits for some countries in really reaching the conclusion that it would be a commodity based on a number of factors that they have. For instance, a well-developed commodities market in their regions, and they know how to treat that from a financial, from an accounting and fiscal perspective. And then finally, there is the possibility of looking at a carbon credit as a financial asset. And then specifically here, there are some experiments going on also in Latin America on tokenizing carbon credits. And it is a new space for regulators to look at. I think that the UK has experience in regulating tokens, and that could be also a possibility, but still a lot to be researched. And I think that this space here with UNCITRAL would be quite interesting for us to further explore in order to provide this support to Latin American countries. I don't think I really have much more to add here because a lot has been said. So I'll stop here and give back the floor to Angelo or to Lisa.
Thank you very much. Now, it's my pleasure then now to invite Lisa DeMarco to present from her perspective, both as a practicing attorney and someone who represents an organization that is so actively involved in here and has very high interest at stake. Lisa, please.
Thank you so much, Angelo, and thank you to the Commission for having us here today. I would love to chat with you about how verified carbon credits have been legally characterized. And in doing so, I think I risk my criteria as an academic in law and taking a very pragmatic and functional approach to what's been happening over the last 25 years that we have been trading carbon actively. Very specifically, we have enforced contracts around trading carbon rights. We have used verified carbon credits for security or collateral in transactions. We have been directly involved in an insolvency where the major asset globally were a form of verified carbon credits in the form of clean development mechanism, certified emission reductions. This has all happened. So what I'd like to do is bring to bear what we think are the essential elements of the legal characterization of a verified carbon credit, but I do so in a context. And the context is this. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its 6th assessment report, has indicated very clearly 2030 is a key deadline. And I quote, "We are in a rapidly closing window to secure a livable and sustainable future for all." And I do the quote with some battle wounds, having been involved in the Paris negotiations and 20 years of United Nations negotiations, watching the last 7 years to get the minute rules defined is too slow for the climate, is too slow for us all. So with that, let's look at what's happening now. And it's not a theoretical problem. This is the subject of an investor-state dispute that's active, awaiting decision right now. And let's see what collectively United Nations bodies can do in warp speed. So let me cut to the chase. The precise legal nature of verified carbon credits is in part, and I'm going to emphasize in part, subject to domestic legal contexts, domestic constitutional contexts in the jurisdiction in question. But, and this is a big but, arguably, over the last 25 years, through multiple standards and systems, we have developed a common set of rights and obligations, legal rights and obligations that are common to all verified carbon credits. Arguably, we've developed a pattern and practice of recognition as to what those legal rights and obligations are. So, looking at how verified carbon credits have been legally characterized, and what are those key elements of, I'm going to use the word property rights that have been associated with them, is interesting. And in part, we can look at what has been done with domestic legal systems. In many instances where verified carbon credits can be used for compliance purposes, we've had some instruction. We've had express legal clarification or clarification of what the rights are not. So using the expressio unius et exclusio alterius maxim of statutory interpretation, we can say we've got some direction. And how have they been characterized in different parts of the world? They've been characterized as a tradable permit, as a limited license, as intangible property, but not property for the purpose of a taking or expropriation when the target or the cap goes down. They've been characterized as a regulatory instrument, which is subject to property rights, and there have been enforceable rights that have been found in related contracts, both in terms of term sheets in the realm of goodwill and in the terms of transactions, in terms of enforceability, and in the terms of insolvency, where entities have stepped in and realized and had priority established and enforced by courts. What are the common rules that we can find in a justum generis, general category, among all of these systems over the last 25 years? In many instances where we have verified carbon credits used purely for voluntary purposes, not for compliance purposes, we see that the integrity and the quality is contingent on compliance with a standard or standards. You heard Annette Nazareth speak to that this morning, and several standards providers exist to define the minimum level of quality and integrity. You see a requirement for independent, arm's length verification that the emission reduction or avoidance or removal has actually occurred in accordance with that standard. You see elements that stipulate the presumption of or required proof of clear title, ownership, clear title that may be transferred. You see transferability. You see a form of consistent accounting, both from an emissions perspective and often from a financial perspective, as we're seeing with the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. You see singular use. No double counting. No double claiming. And you see some semblance of registration or enforceability through a serialized title. All of these give rise to a right to use the claim against a voluntary target. So that's a primary instrument. That's at the point of creation. But is there an actual transition or addition or augmentation of the legal characterization as it goes through the transaction cycle? When a primary, just issued, verified carbon credit is subsequently traded, may domestic laws have certain further guidance for the legal characterization? Well, yes. In the UK, we see further guidance as characterization as a financial instrument. In other contexts, we see Canadian securities regulators providing clarification that in certain instances, carbon credits are a commodity. In other instances where a financial instrument is created based on associated verified carbon credits, and there's a sale of financial interests that might constitute a security, where there's a bilateral over-the-counter transaction subject to a contract, may also be subject to a series of contractual rights that are added on to those fundamental legal principles. And last but not least, when it comes time to account for, to benefit from, and to sell those verified carbon credits, the tax person generally has their hands on the associated revenues, and there have been varying characterizations as either verified carbon credits as either an asset or a contingent liability, depending on whether or not you're the buyer or the seller. So I would encourage the collection of UN bodies to work in the context of that very pressing timeline, to work together and codify the basic pattern and practice, the basic rights that we have seen across 2.5 decades of carbon-related transactions that have resulted in real, verifiable, beneficial emission reductions, removals, and avoidance around the world. We need that money to flow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, not only for what sounds to me as a wonderful summary of 20 years of legal experience and practice, but also of wonderful summary of 20 years of legal discrepancy as well, but also for the message on the pressing need for something to be done. With that, I would then turn the floor to the audience. Are there questions you'd like to ask the speakers from the floor? La Côte d'Ivoire, s'il vous plaît.
Côte d'Ivoire, please.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. I listened very closely to the excellent presentations delivered during the course of today. And just before the afternoon break, I was questioning the legal nature of carbon credits. I had some questions about that. But now, in light of the panelists' presentations this afternoon, Professor Giraud and Professor Zhang and Madame Lisa, while they have most tactfully sought to describe or delineate the legal nature or status of carbon credits, they haven't necessarily qualified or described the legal nature of carbon credits. But by listening to them, it gives us an idea of the trend in which things are going. So my question, the fact that UNCITRAL is starting to look at climate change in connection with trade law, should this give us some form of guidance, some form of orientation on whether carbon credits should come under private law rather than under international public or trade law? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I assume this is a question that is addressed to all panel speakers, and I would then give the question back to them in the reverse order in which they have spoken. Lisa, please.
Premièrement, merci beaucoup.
First of all, thank you very much. I'll try to answer in French, but apologies in advance. It seems to me that there is indeed a position taking shape for both camps, private law and public law, for these two camps to work together in order to provide some form of security or certainty from which the strength of the market derives, in particular in those countries that have in place infrastructure in order to help grow their economies, in order to thus ensure climate adaptation, and in so doing, improving their GHG performance, and as such, mobilizing or harnessing the funds that they can gain from the carbon markets based on a strong and secure legal regime, for instance, comprising registration and other related actions, which are quite ordinary in any other financial market. So as I see it, there is a growing alignment between public law and private law in this regard. But let's hear from the others.
Thank you very much, Tatiana.
I think I will defer that to the lawyers.
Yeah, but you may also feel free from your perspective as economist and someone who works for MFI to express, your views or what you've heard in practice from what the implications are from one or the other qualification, because this is at the end of the day what the boils down to. I mean, we're not here to prescribe to states what they should do, but a useful role that an entity like ours could play is to draw their attention to the, the definition, the characterization of carbon credits or other similar rights or green bonds and other investment vehicles, what consequences, the implications that might have for the decisions of the market participants and also for the costs of the structure of transactions. But yeah.
I think I liked very much the approach that Xiaoping brought in his presentation, where he showed the flow of the carbon credits, how they're their value chain at the end of the day, right? And where public law applies and private law applies. So I think that this could be an interesting way of looking at it. That would be sort of my opinion on that. But in addition, if we are talking about the role that the private sector has in really scaling up carbon markets, it seems to me that the way that carbon credits are defined could be under private law. But again, I go back to the chart that Professor Xiaoping presented, in which when you are talking about trading these credits, selling these credits, then it's about private parties at the end of the day. So it seems to me that private law would make the most sense at that point of the value chain.
Thank you. Since your name, Professor Zhang, could you?
I have one thing to add. Generally, my model is applied to the compliance market. For the voluntary market, it looks a different story because if considering the baseline and credit model, it seems that the enterprise earned credit by themselves. But finally, if you check the whole process, if they use that credits for the purpose with public implications, again, the public authority intervened to some extent. So even the involuntary market, this model still applied, but the only difference is the extent to which the public authority intervened. That's my answer. I would like to add. Thank you.
If I can just provide emphasis to that point made, in fact, all voluntary standards have a required element of local and community stakeholder consultation as part of being able to register the project, as part of the methodology.
Thank you very much. Professor Delassus?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for your question. I think that the question shows that carbon credits are something that are difficult to classify, generally speaking. They don't fit into the legal categories that we usually work with. An initial comment: we should not overestimate the difference between public law and private law. It may not be such a great issue for all states, so everything depends on the context. Secondly, in the area of environmental law for a long time now, and I teach environmental law, public law on the environment, so we see that environmental protection is not just governed by public law. There's also arrangements and agreements between private players, and then international law and the various standards that are emerging there. I think that we need to have a pragmatic approach on this matter. There are two things that need to be regulated. The first is the creation of carbon credits, and the second is trading in carbon credits. These are two different issues, but they do need to be provided with a sophisticated and robust governance system. It may be possible that the involvement of public law and private law in the two different areas may be different, but what counts is that the two elements should be very clearly defined. So we need to focus on how we will regulate and govern creation and trading. And I think that the tools that we use for that may be less important than the actual result that we're aiming for.
I see the International Commercial Law Research Center of the Russian Federation, please.
Hello. Yeah. Dear colleagues, thank you, and thank you, dear panelists, for all your very interesting communications and the messages which you delivered to us. I have a question, actually two, and one of them is kind of provocative, I say. So I personally, as a lawyer, am very kind of huge fan of legal clarity, especially with respect to the legal nature of carbon credits. But since throughout the whole history of carbon markets, we've seen that kind of reaching not only a harmonized approach towards the legal nature of carbon credits is relatively impossible. Also, in some states, defining the legal nature, is not being kind of achieved. But at the same time, the use or trade with such carbon credits is nonetheless being made. And therefore, my question here is whether it is really important for us to, seek for this kind of approach towards clarity as it relates to the legal nature, but rather approach the question of defining some pillars of legal regime over carbon credits. And as elements of such legal regime, maybe we should kind of look at some particular kind of issues which probably could be like whether a carbon credit could be held by a person, whether it could be transferred by a person, whether there are any limits in possible ways of using these carbon credits, like using it as a collateral or in any other way. Yeah. In this case, we could maybe, achieve some kind of harmonization of a whole kind of path, not making this particular kind of moves towards kind of reaching this almost unreachable thing, of defining this legal nature of carbon credits. So this would be the first question, right? So the question would be whether we need this defining the legal nature, and maybe instead we should rather focus on defining the legal regime in terms of particular things or issues involved in existence of carbon credits. And the second question would be, should we not, before we talk about the legal nature of carbon credits, decide on particular kind of approach towards the difference or distinction between two types of markets which actually give us these different carbon credits, and I mean like mandatory carbon market and voluntary carbon market. And the reason why the reason why I raised this question is because, for example, in one of the previous papers by UNCITRAL, we had this kind of approach towards the division between these two markets, which were like mandatory market and then a voluntary market based on the existence of regulatory perspective in a particular market. But even today, we say about compliance markets, or we kind of start talking about this mandatory market, or at least as I heard that, we start talk about that from the perspective of not the existence of regulatory regime, but rather from the perspective of the particular units or carbon credits which are being which exist within the market, like for example emission allowances, and by that we say that this is like a mandatory market. And the question here is maybe we should also kind of discuss or make more clarity on that particular perspective, because after that we will have more clear understanding of the nature of carbon credits which are generated on those markets. So that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Who would like to take that? Lisa?
I'm happy to. Let me very respectfully disagree with the proposition of the bright white line between mandatory and voluntary markets. In fact, the Paris Agreement, Article 6, has gone in the opposite direction. And they allow for voluntary credits to be authorized for use for Paris compliance. So you have a voluntary instrument converging with the compliance system in a domestic country. And we're seeing this not just under the Paris Agreement. We're seeing this in California, under California law. There's associated ability to use voluntary instruments appropriately certified and issued for compliance with the mandatory compliance system. Similarly, in Canada, their mandatory carbon instrument allows for, the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act allows for the use of voluntary offsets to comply with the output-based pricing system imposed on emitters. Similarly, in the UK, there's talk of use of related emission removals, and there's a number of systems that encourage that innovation, that encourage the voluntary system to facilitate ongoing innovation for compliance with a mandatory system. And I think that's the right way to go. I think it's been very good at facilitating things like direct air capture and associated long-term sequestration. It's been very good at facilitating things like methane reductions through new technology and many other innovative agricultural practices, etc. In terms of the first question, in relation to the associated distinction between the regime first versus the unit, do I have that right? Let me just check my notes here. The regime versus the rights. I think you're arguing for the regime to be defined first and then figure out what are the common rights. And I hope that the emphasis of my comments were, in fact, the opposite way around. There are common rights that we can realize now around the world in relation to voluntary, very verified carbon credit. Similarly, common rights associated with many allowances that if we codify what those essential rights are, the interpretation, the characterization in a domestic legal context can acknowledge those rights and still be subject to the particularities of the constitutional structure, of the legal structure, of the jurisdiction in question.
I'm very sorry. Just to make it clear, it was the distinction between the legal nature and the legal regime. So here are here is the point which is to be discussed, not the rights which are actually the elements of both. But thank you. Yeah.
I'd like to add a few words, and I will put it in the outward way. Sometimes my instinction is that the proper defined legal nature would help to reduce the transaction cost. Sometimes, even if you don't define it properly, it still can work in the real world, but with more money, more time, and more expenditure. So that's why today we mentioned so frequently the legal nature. And I would like also quote English jurist Henry Maine in his book Ancient Law. He says something like this: when something new emerges in a society, we have three ways to handle it. First is about equity. Equity means solve the problem on a case-by-case basis. Problem solved, raise, problem solved, problem raised again, problem solved. This is the first stage. Second is to friction. Friction means you pretend A to be B because you already have B. So it looks nothing has changed. I think we are at the second stage. We pretend carbon credits to be a administrative license, to be a financial instruments, to be a property rights. But actually it's not. And the third stage is legislation, where the gap between the reality of the society and the legal systems are too large. You need to do new legislation. I think that's part of the reason we gathered here today and part of the job of the next step. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So on the questions, I would say. The second question, I will just answer by echoing what Lisa has been saying. We are witnessing an increased convergence between the compliance or the regulated market mechanisms and the voluntary carbon mechanism. So I think this is why I was mentioning that in my presentation that the reflection on the legal status of carbon credits should not be envisioned in a too narrow way, if I could put it that way. We have to base this discussion on a comprehensive approach. So yeah, I'll stop there for the second question. On the first question, I think it's very interesting because we can discuss about the legal nature of the carbon credit, but at the end of the day, what really matters is that wherever we are, in whatever jurisdiction we are, we know that we can do the same thing with the carbon credits than in the other jurisdiction. So I think we may have to approach this with, this is why I was referring in my presentation to a functional equivalence. What matters is not so much the legal status domestically, which is a context-dependent question, but to make sure that in every jurisdiction the same things can be done with carbon credits.
Thank you very much. I was listening to you, and I like very much your quote, and the stages that you describe, Professor Zhang, equity, friction, and legislation. And I also listened to what Elisa said, and I'm reminded of an expression that Peter Werner used this morning, and ISDA uses in its papers and the various categories. And so one of them is a bundle of rights, and he refers to that. Of course, a dogmatic thinking lawyer would say this is not a legal category. This is not how we describe a legal phenomenon, a bundle of rights. It is, however, interesting to look at it, because if you are at the friction stage, we may decide that we want perfection and legislation and find the ideal categorization, or we may accept the imperfection of the word and say, actually, what we need is a functional basis that if countries are not ready to do the perfect or to find the best universal categorization, at least there is a common ground that will be recognized everywhere, and they'll be labeled differently in different legal systems, right? So thank you very, very much for that. But I see also that Singapore had a question.
Thank you. I would like to thank all the speakers for their very illuminating analysis of the issues. I think it's fairly clear that perhaps from what we have heard that there's really no certainty as to the specific categorizations within domestic law. I have a question really on the way forward, which is why we are here. In terms of international standardization or harmonization, what really should be our approach? Because from what we hear, from the point of view of categorization, even the same terms may mean different things under legal systems. So it may not be so easy, for example, to have a room from people with various legal philosophies to agree on calling it A or B or C. Would it then mean that the best approach from the international angle is to really to come to agreement on the rights and obligations as opposed to just legal categorization or nomenclature? Thank you.
Of course, I would leave that to the speakers to express their opinion on, and then eventually the Commission also to discuss this further on Monday. It would, I'll simply come to my mind that this functional equivalence approach is one that is tested here and also elsewhere. By the way, both UNCITRAL and UNIDROIT have used in different contexts. I think, for example, of the Geneva Convention to Mediated Securities, but also of the work on our work on secure transactions, to a very large extent, is a work on functional equivalence. And now, whether we want to set a standard or simply do a sort of mapping of what the legal issues are and say, at the very least, you have to provide for this for the systems to function, is something that, of course, would be open for discussion by our member states when they get to that. But perhaps also the members of the panel have views on that. I don't know who would like to start.
Okay, I can.
You and Lisa. And, Yes.
Yes. So I think maybe a possible way forward would be to identify a set of questions, set of issues on which clarity is needed, and also identify an outcome on which everyone agrees on what should be or could be done with or could not be done with carbon credits. So I will start by asking those questions, and the legal nature, the legal rights, those are very complex issue to discuss at the international level because of the differences that exist between the domestic legal system. So I think what matters is to have a precise idea of what is desired as the way we can use carbon credits throughout the states. I think I would start by this. I should also add, and that is the perspective from the legal scholar, I would be very interested in knowing what are the kind of carbon credits that states are using. Maybe this is also something that could be interesting to have, like a sort of taxonomy the different kinds of carbon credits that are in use today. It's evolving very rapidly, and to have just a good idea of what is going on at the domestic level, I think it would be interesting. Thank you.
Lisa?
I think that's an excellent question, and I'm largely in agreement with Cheryl. The timing is such that whatever is most expedient for you as UN bodies to get to an outcome where there are basic minimum elements that constitute the rights associated with getting the finance flowing is necessary. That can be done in a framework. That can be done in a Q&A document. Let's not let form impede the progress of function in this regard. The functional equivalence approach, a functional and pragmatic approach, defining the basic rights. We know where we have to get to. We know what's causing the transaction cost to rise, and I agree very deeply with my colleague. We also know what is impeding dollars from flowing, and it's the lack of clarity on the basic outcomes. You must be able to transfer the rights. You must be able to ensure that you have ownership of rights. You must be able to ensure that they are verified in accordance with the standard, minimum basic standard. And presumably, we really want them to be used as collateral to support clean infrastructure around the world.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Mexico?
Thank you very much. Well, and thank you, every one of you, for your very interesting presentations. And regarding Ms. DeMarco's presentation, which was somewhat a very positive view of the last 25 years of trading of carbon credit-related rights. And I was wondering about the flip side. If you have witnessed to cases where these different treatments between different jurisdictions have given rights to, for instance, impossibility for enforcement or for recognition of related rights. Thank you.
Absolutely. And if I painted too rosy a view, please let me tell you I have many battle wounds. And in particular, I think the one that stands out for me was in the instance of insolvency. It was a result of the rules changing retrospectively. So retrospective regulation versus retroactive regulation with retrospective application is particularly problematic and should be avoided at all costs. The stark stops and starts in a market are problematic. Smooth transitions are much more beneficial. Similarly, issues in and around governing law and conflict of laws and a unified system of dispute resolution that is conducive to rapid, certain, predictable outcomes is very helpful. And we know there are going to be changes. We know this is a dynamic field, and hopefully we benefit from increasing legislation throughout the world and increasing knowledge around mitigation and adaptation. So doing so on a prospective basis with those smooth on-ramps is very important. Also providing for some good enforcement. Very important. And I will emphasize the Indigenous context just a little bit as well, making sure that we involve our local peoples and Indigenous persons throughout the world is very critical.
Thank you. Anna, you wanted to make a comment?
No, I wanted to ask a question relating to the two areas that you have flagged, and particularly the one of insolvency. Why would we consider that the harmonized and well-developed framework for insolvency that UNCITRAL has developed would not be adapted to carbon credits? Why would there be a need for something else, or why would they need a special treatment?
If I might, I think your framework might be well suited, assuming they are, in fact, property rights.
I think my understanding that may be that when insolvency, but generally the carbon credits will, if you have carbon credits in your account, it is for first to pay the debtors or first to submit to the property governing authorities to fulfill your duty under ETS for compliance. That's I think that's something we need to clarify in the future.
Yeah, maybe the participants may have their own views on that, but my recollection of our discussions with ISDA and with others on this has been the laws as such, they can work. The problem is that there is uncertainty as to how apply the laws to this particular type of asset, and to take the example, say the model on cross-border insolvency, if you have here a company that has a sizable portfolio of carbon credits, is this attracting insolvency jurisdiction, yes or no? I mean, are these really assets? And if such, you may justify the jurisdiction to open main or non-main insolvency proceedings here, but if it's only a governmental license, then say you may lack the basis for opening a proceeding on the basis of the existence of assets in a particular jurisdiction. This is what has been relayed to us as one example. Also, when it comes of secure transactions, there's this issue of how a portfolio of carbon credits, to what extent it can be used to post security in financial markets, also to comply with Basel III requirements, right? So this is, but maybe, Lisa, you have your own.
I speak only from experience in an insolvency under the CDM, where the insolvency took place under Irish law. The company and its assets were listed on the London Stock Exchange, and the company was U.S. So the associated issues, trying to have an insolvency regulator wrap its head around effectively an asset class that it hadn't seen before, and having to walk through in minute detail proof of every element of the rights that were included, including detailed capacity building on what was then the clean development mechanism, which is complicated, was very time-consuming and very, very costly. Could have been very much streamlined through some certainty on some of the key elements.
But my follow-up question to go as to tell you where I am currently in listening to all of you and all the points you're making is, does that deserve a specific insolvency regime? No, I don't think so. So that's my point, you know. I think that all the rules are there. It's just a matter of saying they will apply to this particular asset.
To what is the issue? Yeah. Yes.
Any more questions from Israel, please?
Thank you, Angelo. Just one question, I think, to Professor Sanjans, if I'm not pronouncing it right. In your one question that came up in our consultation, in your comparative study, and I think you referred to it in general, but maybe I'm wrong. On paragraph 20, you refer to, in document 1153, you also refer to non-GHG mitigation outcomes. And a kind of question that came up is, I mean, how does this figure in to the work that you are envisioning on this? Because it looks like it's changing, it's a bit shifting the focus. And again, I'm stressing what we said before, that especially for the purposes of consultation, and I think most of us here in the room are not environmental experts, we really need to know what is the intention in order to consult with our people for the next commission session. Thank you.
So non-JG mitigation outcome is a form of ITMO that can be generated. And essentially what it is something that does not represent a certain amount of JG, or not, at least it is not expressed in terms of JG. It's expressed with another metric. It could be the hectares of land afforested, or it can be the kilowatts produced with renewable energy. And I remember during the negotiations, the Article 6, it was a difficult topic because some states are saying that their NDC is not expressed only in JG metrics. So essentially, if we only use ITMOs calculated in JG metrics, it means that the NDCs are no longer nationally determined, because if you want to use Article 6, you need to have a mitigation target that is expressed in JG. So the decision was taken to allow for the use of other kind of non-JG ITMOs. There's, however, uncertainty on whether or not this will be used. It's not very clear at the moment. It's a possibility that exists. But to answer your question more directly, I don't think it fundamentally changes the nature of our discussion, because at the end of the day, the same questions that we are discussing about carbon credits will arise in relation to this. Do you have a valid property right on it? Can you use it as a collateral, etc.? Those are questions that might arise as well if those type of things, I should say, are in use. So I don't think it's a fundamental issue that it is expressed on JG or non-JG metrics.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that our colleagues in the panel would also have further thoughts to offer to that, and maybe also other questions are open, but we have exhausted the time and I suppose also the strength of our interpreters for today with questions of a technical nature, a vocabulary that is not the bread and butter of the UNCITRAL vocabulary. I thank them for bearing with us up to now. And we'll have between now and the side event 10 minutes which you can relax, but also perhaps discuss any further questions that you have on that. I hope to see you all in this room for the side event in 10 minutes. But first, join me in a round of applause for our speakers this afternoon.